Today we're going to be exploring ancient Mexico, and we'll see that there are some megalithic elements, very subtle as compared to places like Peru, Bolivia, or Egypt, but they are present. And of course, the Spanish conquest was devastating to the ancient cultures of the Olmec, the Maya, the Toltec, and the Aztec, but surprisingly, to this very day, there's still ancient ceremonies that are being conducted, such as here at the ancient and huge site of Teotihuacan, located about 2 hours outside of Mexico City. So when we went there on tour, we were actually able to hire a native group to perform ceremonies before we went into Teotihuacan. And there's been a fair bit of reconstruction, and you can see more or less that these monuments were made out of volcanic stone with local ash used as a type of concrete. They would add some lime into the ash, and that would form primitive concrete. And intriguingly, you can see in the middle of the photo at the bottom, there's some very relatively large chunks of stone that seem out of place. And so that's what we're going to be looking for, not only the grandeur of the accomplishments of people such as the Aztec and Toltec, but the fact that some of these locations seem to be much older and were reconstructed, again, like we see in places like Peru and Bolivia. So for example, again, it's quite subtle, but if you look on the left-hand side and the top, you see relatively small rough stone construction with mortar made from the volcanic ash. But the staircase is made of basalt blocks, and they fit together without any kind of cement or mortar whatsoever. So I think that the staircase is original and was discovered by the cultures that we know of, and then they decided to reconstruct, and we'll see more and more examples of that as we go along. So here again, you can see kind of rubble on the right-hand side, but then finely finished blocks of basalt, especially up in here to the left, locking into place. And then the faces that are carved are likely older pieces of stone that were shaped by the later cultures. So again, very subtle compared to what we see in the more classic megalithic sites, but still present. And this is called the Temple of the Moon. And as we progress, we'll see again that parts of the central staircase appear to be older with tight fitting basalt stone. And I think that was found in place, and then the rebuilding happened thousands of years afterwards. So this is what I'm trying to show you. You see the staircase, it has been repaired, but the blocks appear to have been cut, possibly by machines. The cultures of this area did not have any real bronze technology or metals of any kind, and basalt is quite a hard stone, so how this was shaped by them appears to be not the case. They seem to have been inherited. And again, compare the construction of the staircase with the much rougher construction on the right-hand side. The whole area is volcanic stone, so it would be relatively easy for a large group of people to be able to find enough material to build these monuments. But again, I think you have two different levels and periods of construction. And here's another example. This woman is sitting on a basalt block that must weigh at least 2 tons, and it's up on top of the first course of the staircase. And so that's very anomalous in comparison to the other material that we see here. That clearly seems to have been shaped, and I think it's an older aspect of the construction. And this just shows you the sheer grandeur of the Temple of the Sun. So the main monuments at Teotihuacan are the Temple of the Moon, which is down over this way, and then the Temple of the Sun. So it's huge in terms of its size. Supposedly there are tunnels inside of it, which would be quite ancient. but it's not something like the Giza pyramids where you have an obvious number of major chambers like the King's Chamber or Queen's Chamber. On the top and the back side of this monument, there is a metal gate that is locked, and there appears to be at least a small tunnel that goes inside. It's not accessible to the public, so it's just one of the little mysteries that we find at Teotihuacan, which is one of the largest ancient monuments in Mexico. The Aztec utilized this complex, but they didn't construct it. It said that they found it when they were making their way to what would become Mexico City from their ancient homeland called Aztlan, which supposedly was the white land to the north. And some people suspect that Aztlan is derived from Atlantis. Whether that's just a play on words or not is not really known. And then we move to Tula, and Tula is located as well about 2 hours from Mexico City in another direction. And most of its complexes are quite small in scale, but we do have these famous statues, which are called the Tula warriors. Some people have called them the Atlantean warriors, but that was actually a term phrased in the 18th or 19th century by a foreign author who went there and coined the term the Atlantean soldiers or Atlantean warriors. You can see that they're made of multiple sections of stone, each one weighing at least a ton, and the actual quarry is said to be quite far away. So these were crafted most likely by the Toltec people. This gives you another view of what they look like. They have been reconstructed. When they were discovered by archaeologists, they had fallen over. So you can see relatively modern concrete was utilized to repair and put them back together again. And this just shows you a sense of scale. That, of course, is me next to one of the warriors. And in the right hand, some people have said that they're holding a kind of laser weapon, and in the left hand they're holding other kinds of exotic weapons. But in fact, a local source told us that the so-called laser weapon is like a little crossbow. They were able to get rubber from the Olmec country, which is more of the jungle, and they were able to construct quite small crossbows. So that's what is in one hand, and in the other hand are the arrows, which are about that long. So for very close to combat. But this is quite intriguing, and this is something that you don't expect to see. This man was selling antiques, going back likely to the Toltec period, and there you can clearly see a humanoid figure with an elongated head. So that came as a complete surprise to us. I'm a reasonable expert as regards antiquities, and so I could tell by the patina of the stone that it was a very ancient figure. It wasn't a reconstruction. And so he was selling it, but it's completely illegal to buy pre-Columbian artifacts and take them out of the country. And something of that size would clearly show up in the x-rays at the airport. And rather than be arrested, I decided to just take photographs of it. This is not the man who was selling them, but just a local gentleman who decided to pose with this very odd-looking sculpture so that I could take pictures. And in Mexico City itself, unfortunately, Tenochtitlan, which was the original name by the Aztecs of Mexico City, the Spanish completely destroyed the ancient Aztec capital. They tore all of the ancient temples down and reconstructed them in the form of churches. So unfortunately, most of what's left of Tenochtitlan is rubble, more or less, and because of earthquake activity as well over the course of time, these temples could be very, very ancient, but an earthquake would cause damage and then reconstruction. But what's intriguing is this is a reconstruction of one of the major temples of Tenochtitlan, and you can see different layers of construction and even air gaps in between. So that would be a very complex form of construction where one temple would be built, and then over the course of time, another would be built on top, and then on top, and then on top. So this is probably at least 4 different levels of construction, and this is what that temple would have looked like at the time of the Spanish conquest. But it's when you're looking at the rubble and the different artifacts that you see huge pieces of stone like this put on display. Where it originally was, we don't know. But again, that's a giant block of basalt. And to me, the surfaces, at least some of them, look machined. So it's what we call an out-of-place artifact. We don't know where it was originally located. We don't know where the quarry is that it was taken from. And so I think that's something that the Aztec found in this location and then utilized it in the construction. And then with the destruction by the Spanish conquistadors and others that came later, it's quite possible that this was so big and the stone is very hard that they decided, rather than using it or breaking it up into pieces for church construction, it was just left off to the side. But that leaves it to us as an interesting artifact. And then here too, this is Mona, who was on one of our tours, and she's standing next to another rather large piece of stone that was not utilized by the Spanish stonemasons, and so it leaves it as an artifact for us to ponder over. And here we have obsidian artifacts, and obsidian is a volcanic glass. There's a lot of it found in the area, but these are so perfectly symmetrical that it looks like that they had to have been made on lathes of some kind. And the Aztecs, of course, did not have that kind of technology. So I think these, again, are artifacts that were made in the very distant past, were found by cultures like the Aztec, and then utilized as ornaments. These could very well have been used as earrings of some kind or pendants. And the little vase you see in the middle, again, perfect bilateral symmetry. And so that had to have been made on some kind of machine lathe. And that kind of technology, of course, was completely unknown by all of the ancient cultures of Mexico, going from the Aztec all the way back to the oldest established culture, the Olmec people, who were the ones supposedly responsible for the construction of the giant stone heads that they're most famous for. And this is just a close-up of that little vessel. Again, almost perfectly bilaterally symmetrical, and it's put on top of another artifact, which is a little sculpture. So I think the artifact on top is from a much older age, when there was advanced technology in Mexico, and it was found and utilized as an ornament. And these, again, are some other of these artifacts. Again, I think the artifact on the right looks like it's damaged, and that could have happened hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. And then the perfect circular object on the left, which had to have been made on some kind of lathe device. Then you have this giant sculpture of Tlaloc, weighing upwards of possibly 100 tons. It was found outside of Mexico City, lying face down. A huge piece of basalt stone. The circles below the eyes and nose appear to be drill holes, but that's a possibility. And it was moved in the 20th century to Mexico City, and that required a massive flatbed truck with multiple wheels to move it. So how it was created in the first place is unknown, because the ancient people of this area, the ones we know of, only had Stone Age technology. Basalt is about 7 out of 10 in terms of hardness, and so you would require tools harder than that, possibly corundum or even diamond, to be able to efficiently shape it. the hands are broken off and the toes are broken off. So this is one of those intriguing ancient artifacts in Mexico, one of the few that's of a scale like this that we have to observe today. And then when we go to the Jalapa Museum, which is located moving into the Olmec country around the Yucatan part, jungle of Mexico, again, these amazing artifacts, these lower ones here, that are perfectly circular and had to have been done by machines. We were lucky to have an engineer with us from the United States who was retired. He had been a manufacturing engineer all of his life. And when I showed them to him, unfortunately, most people are impressed by giant objects. This is a museum that has a lot of the big stone Olmec heads, and this was in a very small case, but my eye tends to look for anomalies. And so when I saw these, I called David to come over. He looked at them, and I said, David, could these be made by hand? And he said, no, that's impossible. So again, ancient artifacts inherited by the established known cultures, but coming from a very distant time. And this is the side view. Again, you see how thin they are and perfectly symmetrical. Some of them show damage that had to be repaired. So out-of-place artifacts, to be sure. These were found in Olmec country and were used by the Olmec as earrings. But they didn't manufacture them, they found them and used them. And just a bit more of a close-up again, you see how perfectly round they are. And in the inside of that one, we could see spiral marks of a cutting machine that would have been used to make them in the first place. And another close-up here, just showing you see the damage in the lower surface there, and then the curvature where the vertical and horizontal meet. So again, these had to have been made by some kind of lathe. Next, we're in the jungle of Chiapas, and this is Palenque. Palenque is most famous for, it's the most famous probably of the Mayan sites. It's also one of the most beautiful, and this is where the famous Lord Pacal's tomb is located. That's the building on the left. Unfortunately, it's closed to the public now, and most of the precious artifacts are now in the major museum in Mexico City. But it is one of the most beautiful landscapes. It's almost like a Japanese garden. Only 10 to 15% of it has ever been excavated, so 85% of Palenque is still in the jungle. And again, this is a very subtle sign of possible lost ancient technology, lost ancient civilization. You see the very kind of rough work here, rough stone with volcanic ash as mortar. And then look at the staircase in the middle. And you see that each one of those is a solid block, and there is no mortar. And also some of them have sunken into the ground. So I think that that staircase is original and then was discovered by the Maya, and they constructed their temple complex around that central staircase. And that is what we find in Peru as well. We see at famous locations like Machu Picchu and in Cusco, megalithic work, which is original, and then the famous Inca culture discovered these monuments, and rather than take the megalithic apart, they clearly respected whoever the ancient builders were and then simply built around that. And I think that's also what we're seeing here at Palenque. So the history of Mexico does not simply go back to the Olmec as a culture. It probably goes back at least another 10,000 years. And here again, you can see some very massive slabs of limestone and a big staircase on the left, tight-fitting stone. The surface carving was probably done by the Maya because most megalithic sites or megalithic aspects do not have artwork whatsoever. You simply have form and function. The classic example of that would be the Great Pyramid in Egypt, where the interior chambers, the Queen's Chamber, the King's Chamber, and the subterranean chamber have no artwork whatsoever. Whereas when we look at dynastic structures, then we see hieroglyphics absolutely everywhere. So rather than the case being that the ancient Egyptians never got around to doing hieroglyphs or ornamentation inside the Great Pyramid, it's clear that they found the Great Pyramid, and I think that's the case here too. The giant limestone slabs, it's not a hard stone, but especially with the staircase on the left, you see no mortar, it's stone on stone construction, whereas the later phases here, you can see mortar in between the stones, and again, the ornamentation looks fresher than the original surface. We're talking hundreds of years old in terms of the carving, but still the patina of the flat surfaces is darker, indicating it's older. And so in contrast, look at the staircase on the left. It's made of very small, relatively small stones, maybe this big, very roughly hewn, and then mortar is used to fuse the whole thing together, and contrast that to the much larger vertical pieces of stone here that I think were found on location, put back into place, and then carved by the Maya people. And again, look behind this lady. Again, not huge stones, but this first course, you can see the stones fit very tightly together, whereas right in behind it, on the left, you see much rougher work and lots of the mortar used to fuse it together. So I think this level here is older, and the area behind it is later. Again, Mexico is very subtle that way. When you go to Egypt, it's night and day, and the same thing in parts of Peru and other countries. You see construction that's very easy to understand in terms of how it was made, and then other aspects that look technically almost impossible, even for us in the 21st century. And now we're still at Palenque, and if you look above, you see again relatively small stone rough construction, lots of clay mortar, and then these rather massive slabs, each one of which fits tightly together, but they all show signs of ancient damage. And it could very well be that this work originally was done prior to the time of what we call the ancient cataclysm, which occurred on the planet about 12,000 years ago. So it is possible that some of the ancient sites of Mexico are 12,000 plus years old, and that's what we also believe is the case in, again, Peru, Bolivia, and Egypt, Lebanon, and other locations. So you see how tight-fitting the ancient stonework was, and again, it's all shifted out of place, as if a massive earthquake of some kind has altered the appearance of it. The Maya were not able to move the stones in order to do the repair work, so they were forced to basically leave it the way they found it, and that's good for us, because that shows us that there was at least one ancient cataclysmic event at Palenque a long time ago. And here again, if you look above, you see smaller construction, and then below, you see quite massive slabs of stone shifted in position. So we're looking at two different time periods. The Maya work is above, and the older masterwork is below. And here too, this is in Mexico, and this actually is showing you what Mayan construction looks like. So it's not as tight-fitting or megalithic in scale as we see here. Like, this is very tight-fitting work, especially that little stone there, formed and fit into place. But this is what classic Maya looks like. There has been modern-day restoration, but you don't see huge pieces of stone incorporated, so this temple is 100% Mayan. There is no megalithic core or megalithic aspect to it, which is good to see because you want to contrast and compare different locations. And this too, it is possible that these stones are from an older period and were later reconstructed, but again, maybe this is the masterwork of Mayan masons. And now we're at Uxmal. And Uxmal is interesting because our guide was a native man, and he understands the ancient Mayan language. And so he was able to tell us what the original names of these places was, and also what the translation of the names were. And so Uxmal means built 3 times. And what that tells us is, I think, is that the 3rd time period was likely the later Maya, the 2nd time period was the early Maya, and the 1st time period was the ancient megalithic. We do find megalithic aspects at Uxmal, not here in particular, but the fact that the place is named built 3 times means 3 time periods of construction. And again, it's mildly subtle, but if you look in this area, you see relatively large column sections and then almost rubble-like construction in behind. The main temple here is made of probably millions of stone, but they're all random shapes and sizes glued together with this volcanic mortar. And these stones look like they were cut with saws of some kind, which was not a technology that the Mayan people had. So these stones may have been recycled from an earlier construction and then incorporated into the temple. And here, quite a tight-fitting wall you can see. This could be from the 1st construction time period, and then it may have been repaired. These stones to me look like they have been cut with saws, but then later repair work was done. So it's possible that a massive cataclysm or earthquake damaged or destroyed this temple structure, and then the Maya people found it and they rebuilt it. And here you have another interesting example. Again, here you have very large stones relatively. They look like they've been cut by saws. And then you have filler here of much rougher material. So I think this is an ancient structure that was found by the Maya, and then they rebuilt it, and they did not have this level of technology, so they scavenged what they could from the area, and then took rougher stone and simply filled the wall back in again. And here, if you look at these lintels are quite massive, and then the work above is very rough. So I think these lintels are recycled or were recycled from an earlier culture that had a relatively high level of technology, and they were simply utilized by the Maya since they were on location anyway. And these columns could be as well. They're about 6 feet tall, and again the lintels are quite massive, and compare their scale with the foundation. Now a foundation is supposed to be made of large stones as possible because you want the foundation to be very strong, but it's quite weak, and so I think these are recycled elements from the first culture of the area. And that's in contrast to what conventional history tells us. Normally you're supposed to go from primitive to complex, but what we're seeing is complex at the beginning and primitive later on, as if obviously knowledge was lost and forgotten. And again, I think this is another example of a much more sophisticated culture being there first, and then cataclysmic damage to the structure, and then rebuilding with filler by the Maya. Because this is Maya construction. Let's contrast this with that at the same location. It's not a case that you would have the best sculptors do this and then students do that. You want a continuous look. And so again, I think this is showing that two cultures were involved. This also is in the Yucatan area. And now we are at Chichen Itza. And at Chichen Itza, again, the internal material is quite rough. The external material is quite fine. Either the external material was found from an older structure, or they decided to make it look really nice on the exterior, but fill it with rubble. And also at Chichen Itza, again, rough construction here on the left and right, and then very large slabs of stone, limestone, for the staircase. So I think the staircase is original, and then the left and right sides are reconstruction. And here again, the same thing. Rubble below, stone slabs put on top to hide the poor workmanship, and then the master workmanship in the central staircase. So this is likely pure Maya construction. The lintel above looks like it's a giant slab of stone, but it's actually not. It's actually modern concrete was used to do the repair. So that's why the sites in Mexico are very complicated and subtle compared to what we see in places like Egypt. Also, the column in the center was repaired using concrete, incorporating a lot of lime. So that's why it takes a pretty good eye to see the difference between what is a megalithic work and what is a Mayan work, and then what is a modern reconstruction of a Mayan work. And now we're at Tulum, which is close to Chichen Itza, and you can see very, very rough construction. All through the Mayan territory, the only building material they basically had was limestone, and then they would grind up the limestone and cook it with heat in order to create powder, and then they would add volcanic ash to create a primitive concrete. It's actually quite amazing that these structures are still standing to this very day, because it's a very damp environment and right next to the ocean. But this is at the same location of Tulum, very rough work. So Tulum is a 100%, as far as I can tell, Mayan construction. And here as well, even rougher work. And this again, this is another Mayan complex. You can see it's of a reasonable scale, but the construction technique is quite crude. It is quite possible that originally it had a plaster coating so that it looked like very smooth, but over the course of hundreds of years, and then reconstruction by archaeologists, all we have left is the basic form of what it looked like. But this is interesting. If you look at that archway, you can see some quite large blocks of stone, and especially the lintel. This is in Oaxaca, Mexico. And that lintel weighs about 6 tons. And contrast that with the much rougher, smaller work around it. So I think that lintel and some of the uprights of the gate were found at this location, maybe parts of the staircase as well, and then reconstructed by the Zapotec people. And here too, these rather large slabs of stone with surface carving. I think they date from an earlier age, and I think also that the surface carving was done much later by the Zapotecs. And look at the rather crude construction style. You have a large slab, relatively large slab on the left, a much bigger one, and then a smaller one, and then very, very rough construction technique on the right-hand side. And these two contrast the work above with the work below. Surface carving done by the Zapotec people, maybe with Mayan influence, and then much rougher work above and on the left side. Okay, so here as well, this is Monte Alban, which is located in Oaxaca. And look at the disparity in terms of construction. You have a relatively large stone on the left with surface carving, a larger one next to it, a smaller one next to it, and then much smaller stones. So I think the larger stones are from an earlier time period and were reincorporated by the Zapotec people into their later construction. And here as well, why would you have large and small stone construction like this? It doesn't make much sense unless you have two different cultures. And this is also in the same area. Notice how uniform some of these cut marks are. I think this was done with ancient saws, and saws were not known to the Zapotec people. So I think they were aspects that were found on location and then reincorporated into the later construction by the Zapotec people. So contrast the flat surfaces with the really rough work here. That can't be the work of the same technicians. And now it gets even more obvious. Look at the size of that stone to the left of my finger. That's about 6 tons. The one below it is about 1 ton. And this is in the same area of Oaxaca at a site called Mitla. And so if you haven't actually visited the place, it's difficult. Again, it's very difficult if you simply look at photographs, say in a search engine, and try to discern what's going on. But since I was physically there, I was able to figure out that the 6-ton block is basalt. And again, the hardness of basalt is 7 out of 10, and that requires at least carborundum or diamond technology. And these people, the Zapotecs, didn't know metals whatsoever. If they did, they maybe had some copper implements, and copper cannot cut basalt. And more recycling. These large columns, they're about 8 to 10 feet tall. There are about 20 of them located at Mitla, and clearly they're from an earlier construction phase of a people who had lost ancient high technology. And then here again, we see very much a contrast in style. Look at the lintels. That stone here weighs at least 6 tons and clearly looks like it was cut by machines, and contrast that with the wall in behind, much rougher. So once again, the Zapotec discovered an ancient megalithic site and then rebuilt it utilizing whatever was at hand. Of course, they would use any giant stones like this in their construction, and then they had to use other rougher material that was found on location. The fine work on top looks like it may have been machined, but in fact it's quite soft limestone, so they could have shaped that, and it's only superficial work. And here too, you see the lintels are very massive, and then the vertical upright areas very crude. And once again, look at the fine shaping of the basalt blocks below, and then the rougher work in between, and then fine basalt work incorporated to some degree in the upper sections. And even in the church, you see rougher work below, and then the recycling of ancient basalt blocks in the construction of the church. And that's also what we find, of course, in places like Mexico City. There are machine marks on the stones in the construction of the many of the churches and other buildings in Mexico City. And the Spanish conquistadors did not have cutting technology at that level. So it's quite possible that Tenochtitlan, which we know of as Mexico City, was constructed originally thousands of years before the Aztecs discovered it. And more massive blocks like this lintel here. Again, it's about 6 tons in weight. And we found the quarry. It's about 2 miles away. And here again, super tight fitting stonework. beyond the capability of the Zapotec people. So this section here and below could be the original, and then rougher work above. And more giant blocks incorporated into much cruder construction, here and there. And again, more recycling of stone blocks that were likely cut by saws or other kinds of machines below, and then almost adobe material utilized later above. And again, these stones here do not fit into place in terms of, or in relation to the other work that we're looking at. So we're looking again at the recycling of older machined stonework. And for a sense of scale, here's my wife Irene with one of the basalt columns. You can see that it's about 12 feet tall, and the quarry is at least 2 miles away. And me with a 6-ton basalt lintel. Again, contrast the lintel size and shape with the walls underneath it. And in more detail, this is another one. We found about between 10 and 15 of these 6-ton blocks. And here again, the surface facing is a very fine workmanship and is a basalt, and then look at the relative rubble below it. So probably recycling of material. And that, look at the stone on the left near the bottom. That one is 10 tons. Contrast that with all of the rest of the stonework that you're looking at in this picture. And that is the 10-ton stone block. Somebody at some point tried to cut a section off and basically gave up. That's something that we also see in other ancient locations where a more recent culture would move in, such as the Inca, and they would try to cut, in some cases, some of the stonework that they found, and just basically gave up because they didn't have the technology of the original builders. And here again, we have very fine stonework below and rougher work above. Very inconsistent. And again, this section here, these basalt sections that interlock with each other quite perfectly, and then more or less rubble construction above and below. So this could be an ancient foundation that was found in place and then used because of the immaculate stonework. And more of the big columns here, probably in the nature of 5 to 10 tons apiece. And here, look at the stones on the left-hand side, about halfway up. Probably recycled from a later or from an earlier construction. That gives you a sense of scale. That's me with the 10-ton block. And just another one for reference. That's clearly not its original place, so it could have fallen down from an ancient earthquake or other cataclysmic event. That's the quarry. The quarry is 2 miles from the location, and it's still being worked today. And this is the quarry itself. Some of these may be very ancient cut surfaces. Kind of hard to tell. We will be going back. Anything that's intriguing like this, you really have to go multiple times before you can make a proper assessment of what you're looking at. One trip, there's usually so much ancient activity that's going on that it's hard to get the clear picture. But I think we can definitely state that ancient Mexico is far more complicated than what most academics believe.